Welcome everyone to this session, Understanding and Using RSA and IDEA Data to Improve Student Outcomes. I'm Charlotte Alverson, and with me today as my co-presenter is Missy Diehl.
Hi everyone. So today we want to discuss the data that's collected related to students with disabilities for both the Vocational Rehabilitation Program or VR program in accordance with WIOA, as well as education-related data under IDEA. And today we're going to provide an overview of some of that data that's collected and how it can be used for program improvement. We're hoping that this can be a launching point for the collaborative work in the states as you move forward and understand how to use data for strategic planning and data-driven decisions.
Our learning objectives today will start by providing a historical context and an overview of the performance indicators and data collection for students with disabilities through the lens of special education and the VR program. We'll also describe the timelines for data collection and reporting to OSEP and RSA. And then finally, we'll discuss challenges and best practices for both special education and VR, including opportunities for data sharing and data-driven decision-making. We like to start this work grounded in the statutory purposes of each act. So with Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Improvement Act, IDEA 2004, the purpose is to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living.
And in terms of the Rehabilitation Act that was amended by the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA, the purpose of the VR program is ultimately to increase employment of individuals with disabilities, including students with disabilities, in competitive integrated employment. And in order to do that, the workforce systems provided opportunities for individuals with disabilities to participate in job-driven training programs in order to achieve not just employment, but really high-quality employment outcomes. And this goes back to the foundation of the VR program and the principle that individuals with disabilities, including those with the most significant disabilities, are capable of achieving high-quality employment outcomes in competitive integrated employment when they're provided those necessary services and supports.
So under both acts are federal reporting requirements that are intended to measure the state's responsibilities both for compliance as well as results. Under IDEA, the states are required to submit a state performance plan. That state performance plan, or SPP, is to be updated at least once every 6 years. And then through the annual performance report, states report the performance of the state as well as the LEA on targets in the state performance plan. And whether you're submitting a state performance plan or the annual performance report, they're always due on February 1st of each year.
And in terms of federal reporting requirements under WIOA, the VR program is one of the core partners that are identified under WIOA and therefore subject to what we call common performance reporting requirements that all of the core partners must report. So under WIOA, states are required to submit a unified or combined state plan, and that's on a 4-year cycle with a 2-year modification process that just got completed last month, I believe. Additionally, the VR program submits a case service report called the RSA 911. And that's done quarterly. And this quarterly report includes all of the individuals that receive services from the VR program within that quarter. This is submitted no later than 45 days after the quarter's end. And then lastly, there's an annual report called the ETA 9169 or 9169, and that includes the VR program's annual performance data, and that's due October 1 of each year. So this year on October 1 of 2022, it'll mark the 5th annual report for the VR program that gets included. And it would include for data from the program year of 2021. So for the VR program, the program year runs July 1 through June 30, and that's consistent across all those core partners. And this was a change for the VR program under WIOA, because prior to that, the VR program reported data on a fiscal year. So October 1 to September 30th. But now, to be in alignment with all the other core partners, VR now submits on that program year of June 30 to July 1.
Federal reporting requirements for IDEA. As I said, there is the state performance report, state performance plan and the annual performance report. It consists of 17 Part B indicators, and those Part B indicators were chosen because they measure compliance or the results related to youth with disabilities. When we're talking about compliance indicators, those targets have to be set at 100%. There's no option there. Under the result performance indicators, states can set their targets based on stakeholder input. States must set their annual targets for each indicator. And for indicator 17, that's the state systemic improvement plan. It addresses a specific state identified measurable result for a particular priority area related to student outcomes. So that could be graduation, reading, or post-school outcomes as examples.
All right, and for the VR program, that RSA 911 quarterly report collects all the data that's required that gets included in that annual report, or ETA 9169, and the performance measures, with the exception of the effectiveness of serving employers. So that's dependent upon how each state is approaching that particular measure. So the annual report includes participant characteristics for the program, current program year, as well as the 6 performance measure results. And we'll get into unpacking that in a bit about what those are.
So OSEP established the Technical Assistance and Dissemination Program in order to help states meet the reporting requirements. For those of you who have been in the field for a while, you may be familiar with the original 6 regional resource centers. Those 6 regional resource centers became the RRCP, or the Regional Resource Center Program. At the same time that that was happening, there were individually funded centers that focused on dropout prevention for students with disabilities, post-school outcomes, as well as the Secondary Transition Technical Assistance Center. And then in 2015, the 3 transition-related centers became NTACT. And then in 2020, the collaborative, or NTACT-C, was formed in collaboration with NTACT and WinTACT.
So much like what Charlotte described for the technical assistance and dissemination centers that are funded under RSA, they've kind of gone through a similar evolution, where prior to 2008, there were regional rehabilitation continuing education programs, or what we called RCEPs. And then in 2008, they started to consolidate into 10 technical assistance and continuing education centers, but they were still regionally based. Then in 2015, you saw more national technical assistance centers getting awarded that were topically based. That's where WinTAC and YTAC and the Targeted Communities Grant were formed. And then in 2020, in addition to what NTACT, the collaborative that Charlotte and I represent, RSA funds other technical assistance centers, including one on quality employment and one on quality management.
So you might be wondering, why are we talking about this? And let's put it in a little bit of context. So you have the IDEA indicators, you have the WIOA measures, but really at the heart is the student and performance of the program success that we want to talk about. And although federal reporting and requirements for each of the statutes are very important, it really is that student and program success that should be driving our work. And it's what we want to maintain the focus on at a student level in order to see improvements that ultimately hit all of the performance measures and ultimately the outcomes for students and youth. We do this by thinking about it as a logic model. So in-school activities are those inputs, exiting school are the outputs, and then post-school outcomes are the ultimate outcomes. So let's unpack this a little bit. Those in-school activities, we think of those as being related to indicator 13. You'll be familiar with those primary bullet points of indicator 13 compliance, but you also see the last bullet there, pre-employment transition services and VR transition services aligned with the IPE and IEP, excuse me. Those are the things that we're putting into preparing students for positive post-school outcomes. The output from those inputs are those ways that students exit school. So thinking about increased graduation rates, increased measurable skill gains and credential attainment rates, and then decreased dropout rates for students with disabilities. That really isn't the outcome. Those are just the midway points. We want to push past those methods of exiting school and in-school gains to think about what is the ultimate outcome for that student or that young adult. And that's increased numbers of students enrolling in higher education, competitive employment or competitive integrated employment, other post-secondary education training, including credential attainment, and other employment.
In the next couple of slides, we wanted to introduce you to a tool, if you haven't seen it, that we had developed along with some partners that really shows the alignment between the VR performance indicators under WIOA, along with 4 of the IDEA Part B indicators, 1, 2, 13, and 14. And we have that resource kind of depicting how each of these performance indicators aligns in the back of this presentation as a link. You can also find it on our website under transitionta.org. But on the next slide, what we're aligning, for example, is the credential attainment rate for under WIOA with indicators B1 and 2. And then on the next slide, we show the credential attainment rate and measurable skill gains in alignment with indicator B13. And then lastly, competitive integrated employment in the second and fourth quarter after exit, as well as median earnings in the second quarter after exit, and credential attainment rate, and how that aligns up with indicator B14.
And so we'll start to look at a little deeper depth with the secondary transition indicators. And again, as Missy said, there is nice alignment. We might be using different language, but what underlies that language is intended to be very similar. So secondary transition indicators, Part B, there are 4 of them. B1 is the percent of youth who graduate. Again, it's a result indicator. B2, the percent of youth who drop out. That's also a result indicator. B13, the percent of youth with required transition components in the IEP. Remember, that's the only compliance indicator related to the transition indicators. And then B14, the percent of youth who achieve positive post-school outcomes. Again, another result indicator. So indicator 1, graduation. It's the percent of youth who with individualized education programs exiting special education due to graduating with a regular diploma. The numerator for this one is the percent of students using, States must report a percentage using the number of youth with IEPs ages 14 to 21 who exited special education due to graduating with a regular diploma. That's the numerator. And then the number of all youth with IEPs who exited special education, again, ages 14 to 21 in the denominator. For indicator 1, you're using the same data as was used to report to the department under section 618 data, using the definition in EDFACS file specification FS009, also known as the 618 exiting data. This is a change. This is a major change. It's different data and different calculations, and therefore states were required to set new baseline and targets for FFY 20. So those data that were reported in February of 2022. Sampling is not allowed for this indicator, and states must provide a narrative that describes the conditions youth must meet to meet graduation with a regular diploma. If that's different for youth with IEPs, states must explain that difference. Indicator 2 is dropout. So it's the percent of youth with IEPs who exited special education due to dropping out. Again, the states must report a percentage using the number of youth with an IEP ages 14 to 21 who exited special education due to dropping out. That's the numerator. And the number of all youth with IEPs who left school ages 14 to 21 as the denominator. Again, using the same data that was used to report to the department under 618 of IDEA, section 618, using the definitions of the EDFACS file specification, again, FS009, or the state special education enrollment data. For 2023 APR submission, so that'll be FFY 21, all states will have to use the 618 data and calculate an exeter or leaver dropout rate. Again, describing the results of the data for the year before the reporting. Again, sampling is not allowed, and states must also provide the narrative that describes what counts as dropping out for all youth. And if there's a difference for those that count as dropping out for all students and students with IEPs, that must be explained. Indicator 13, I'm not going to read all of this, but there are 8 different components to indicator 13 for secondary transition compliance. Because it is a compliance indicator, the target is automatically set at 100%. Data are taken from the state's monitoring or data system in order to collect these data. It varies across districts and states. As a compliance indicator, all non-compliant IEPs must be corrected within 1 year. And most states are using some form of checklist to collect these data. NTACT several years ago created an 8-item checklist. That checklist is optional for use. It's not required, but again, states have some form of checklist that they've either created themselves or as a modification of the NTACT checklist, if not using the checklist itself. This graphic shows the 6-year trend data for indicator 13, and just drawing your attention to the final column, the FFY 2019, the average performance across states was 86% with a range of 11 to 100% compliance. Indicator 14 is post-school outcomes. It's the percent of youth who are no longer in secondary school, had an IEP in effect at the time they left school, and were either enrolled in higher education within 1 year of leaving high school, enrolled in higher ed or competitively employed within 1 year of leaving high school, or enrolled in higher education or some other post-secondary education or training program, or competitively employed or in some other employment within 1 year of leaving school. And so these 3 measures, A, B, and C, are actually derived from criteria that a responder meets from one of these 4 outcome areas. And so just very briefly, higher education, competitive employment, other post-secondary education or training, and other employment. These are hierarchical. And so if a student qualifies for 2 of the categories of outcomes, they're counted in the highest category that they are eligible for. So higher education, enrolled in community college or university and completed 1 term. A student who meets all of those criteria would be counted there. Under competitive employment, states have 2 options for defining competitive employment. The first option is to use the same criteria that have been in place since 2015. That is, worked for pay at or above minimum wage in a setting with others who are non-disabled, working an average of 20 hours a week for 90 days since leaving high school, and that can be 90 cumulative days or consecutive days. And a student who is a former student who's in the military counts as competitive employment. Option 2 aligns the competitive employment definition with WIOA definition of competitive integrated employment. And it adds the criteria of customary pay rate, benefits, and opportunities for advancement. And again, states have the option of choosing which of those 2 options they want to use for competitive employment. Other post-secondary education or training is enrollment in a program that's less than 2 years. And again, they have to have completed that 1 term. And then other employment means that the individual has worked for pay or been self-employed for at least 90 days. And this can include a family business such as a ranch, farm, fishing, catering services, etc. Those 4 outcome areas, higher ed, competitive employment, other post-secondary education or training, and some other employment, are actually collapsed into the 3 measures A, B, and C. There's a 5th category there of outcome titled not engaged. And while that isn't required for reporting purposes, it really is critical when we start to look at why students aren't achieving positive post-school outcomes. And when you're working with locals to look at making those changes at a local level, it's these 5 numbers that are most important, not the combined A, B, and C totals. So if you're sharing data back with your locals, be sure to share back the numbers for each of the 4 outcome categories plus the not engaged category.
I think this is where it gets kind of exciting for me every time I hear Charlotte talk and dig into the indicators under IDEA, which you all are probably much more familiar with. But as I kind of go through the WIOA performance indicators that the VR program is required to report on, I want you to kind of think about those things that Charlotte just went through, because there is so much that the VR program collects on its program participants, much of which is collected in those performance indicators that I'm going to go through. But in addition to that, there's over 300 different data elements that the program collects on every participant that it serves. So there's a lot of information that's available when VR and education can work together and share data to understand what's happening for students. So in terms of the WIOA performance indicators, there are 6 indicators of performance. They include employment rate 2nd quarter after exit. And this is looking at the percentage of unsubsidized employment or competitive integrated employment, which is unsubsidized employment, the employment rate in the 4th quarter after exit, median earnings in the 2nd quarter after exit, credential attainment rate, measurable skill gains, and lastly, the effectiveness in serving employers. For students with disabilities, even though pre-employment transition services is not specifically a performance measure under WIOA, once a student with a disability applies for and is determined eligible for the VR program and starts to receive services under an individualized plan for employment, they become a program participant and are then included in the performance measures. So this data ultimately will help us determine if, for example, pre-employment transition services is effective, or did it do what it was designed to do? And in the future, we hope to be able to see if the receipt of pre-employment transition services makes a difference for students with disabilities in terms of their employment, their earnings, credential attainment, et cetera. We can go to the next slide, Charlotte. So let's just take a moment to kind of pause and think about what I'm talking about when I say a program participant, because in the VR program, we serve individuals who are potentially eligible if they're students with disabilities. So they don't have to be applicants and eligible individuals to receive pre-employment transition services. So these folks are not included in the performance measures because they're not yet what we call a program participant because they don't yet have an individualized plan for employment, but they are included in our reporting in the RSA 911 every quarter. So they're considered what we call a reportable individual. So even though we don't include and aren't required to include those performance reporting on those folks, we do have data that we collect on those students with disabilities in terms of those pre-employment transition services they receive, how they receive them, et cetera. Then for what we call a program participant, these are those individuals, regardless of what, they could be a student with a disability, or they could just be another individual with a disability who's determined eligible and has an approved individualized plan for employment and begun to receive at least one VR service. Those are the individuals we consider a program participant, and they're thus included in the calculations for the performance measures. And those are the folks, which are a subset of all that VR serves, that are in that annual performance report, or ETA 9169. Then the only other definition I wanted to throw in here was an exiter, or what we define as an exit, which is the date the individual's case is closed in accordance with the VR program's requirements, regardless of whether it's successful or unsuccessful. Once that case is closed, that's what we determine an exiter. All right, so I just went off script a little bit, so I just want to catch up to myself here. So the purpose of the program is really to improve transition from secondary to post-secondary education for students and youth with disabilities who receive VR services. And that's done through increasing those opportunities for students with disabilities to improve their practice and work skills, explore those work-based learning experiences, and exploring what post-secondary education and training options they have, so that hopefully that's going to lead to higher earnings and those students earning those industry recognized credentials. So when we start to look at some of these measures, here we both have employment rate at the second and fourth quarter after exit. And these measures are the percentage of participants in unsubsidized employment or competitive integrated employment during the second and fourth quarter after they exit from the VR program. All right, we can go to the next slide. So here we have some data on employment rate at second quarter after exit. And just to put into context, what we're talking about here. So for this one, this is those who exited for the most part in the prior program year, with a few exceptions. So for example, in program year 2020, this reflects those exiters for program year 19. So it's kind of complicated when you look at the cohort of exiters and because of who's exiting and when they exit and when they're included in the calculation. But for today's purposes and in terms of this data, what we know is that for program year 18 to program year 2020, performance declined in this measure by about 4%. So in 2018, the rate of those employed at second quarter after exit was about 50%. And then that declined to about 46.4% in 2020. So in terms of median earnings in the second quarter after exit, this is a measure that's looking at those median earnings of those in unsubsidized employment during that second quarter after exit. And this includes part-time and full-time employment. And here, when we look at the data from 2018 to 2020, we see a slight increase where those median earnings were about $3,875, and that increased to just a little over $4,000 in those median earnings. Next, credential attainment rate. So for this measure, it's the percentage of those participants who are enrolled in an education or training program who attain a recognized post-secondary or secondary school diploma or its equivalent during participation in or within 1 year after exit from the program. So I'm hoping as I'm talking through this, you can kind of see where this alignment is about the data that the VR program collects that you all under IDEA collect under your indicators. So here we wanted to note that the rate more than doubled and the number of participants earning a credential tripled from 2019 to 2020. And then on this next slide, we just wanted to give you an example of the types of acceptable credentials. Again, just to kind of show some of that alignment. So secondary school diploma or its recognized equivalent, associate's degree, bachelor degree, graduate degree for the purposes of VR program, occupational licensure or occupational certification. That includes things like registered apprenticeships or career technical education certifications, or those other recognized certificates or industry occupational skill completion that's sufficient to qualify for entry level or advancement in employment. So a credential is a recognition of a measurable technical industry occupational skill, and they're really based on the standards endorsed by the industry or employers. So again, they're technical in nature or are advanced skills necessary to work in that specific occupation or industry. All right, and then in terms of measurable skill gains, this is the percentage of participants who during the program year are in an education or training program that's going to lead to a recognized post-secondary credential or employment, and who achievement is documented academic, technical, or occupational progress toward that credential or employment. So here's some data to compare the number of all the VR participants versus those participants who are students with disabilities and the total number of measurable skill gains that are reported. And what we really wanted to highlight here was that for program year 2020, most of those MSGs that were reported were through secondary or post-secondary transcripts, which represents over 66% of all of the MSGs reported. So again, it just highlights how important this collaboration is and the demonstration of how we need each other, right? Both to improve outcomes for students, but for our performance reporting to understand what's happening. Now turn it over to you, Charlotte.
Thanks, Missy. It is nice to have that collaboration because as you're saying, the VR data, there's such a richness to that data set that with just our indicator data, we don't have. And we can only take it so far to start to understand what's happening with our students beyond that outcome level. And so this slide is showing the trends of the median percentages for indicator 14 from FFY 14 through FFY 19 for each of the three measures A, B, and C. And what you should notice right away is they're pretty flat across those 6 years. We're not seeing a significant change. If we go back to the beginning of 2009, when this last definition was introduced, you would have seen some increase over time, but we've been pretty much at a plateau for the last 6 years. So starting to understand what's affecting those outcomes, partnering with our VR partners is where we need to go next.
All right. And I think, you know, part of the value and one of the reasons why we wanted to show you some of this national data is because you can see how comparing to these national averages, right? Neither of us are really making a huge impact, right? But we're hoping is that we can start to spark some questions for you all about what specific data in your state looks like and how you can use it to get at the why. Why does it look the way it does? And what is it telling you? And how can you use it to improve some of those outcomes and where those gaps are? So this slide is kind of looking at almost about 10 years of data on the employment outcomes of individuals with disabilities receiving services from the program. So we just wanted to show that it's just that decline in the percentage of individuals who are leaving the program with an employment outcome. And again, just to kind of illustrate that need to kind of show both sides of what's happening for all individuals with disabilities, but particularly for this purpose, students with disabilities. This slide is telling a little bit of a different story. We wanted to show here was that the number of total participants. So these are those eligible for individuals with the VR program who are under a plan. And so we had about 586,000 of those who are not students with disabilities and about 225,000 students with disabilities who were program participants. So again, you're kind of seeing that that represents about 28% of the total participants for the VR program in this particular example. Then of those, how many were applicants to VR? So we have about 25% of students with disabilities who became applicants to VR. And when we look at that and look at how many students with disabilities were potentially eligible, so that's what this middle circle is depicting. Those individuals who weren't participants in the program, but were receiving pre-employment transition services as potentially eligible students with disabilities. And then those students who received services as potentially eligible and got at least one pre-employment transition service. And so, for 2020 data, what we were noting is that only about 42% of those who are potentially eligible students with disabilities actually received at least one service. So, looking at some of the data from program year 17, 18, and 19, we start to see that there is a little bit of a trend of more and more students being served as potentially eligible rather than becoming program participants. And more of those potentially eligible students are not receiving at least one pre-employment transition service. So it kind of creates that notion of, let's be careful we're not creating a bit of a parking lot for kids, and that we are finding ways rather to engage students with disabilities and provide services to them and ensuring that they're getting the services that the law intended for them to receive in order to produce those high quality outcomes and earning potential for students with disabilities. This slide, we wanted to take a different look and take a look at those pre-employment transition services that potentially eligible students did receive. And here we're looking at 3 program years. So program years 18, 19, and 20. And we have all 5 pre-employment transition services listed here. Job exploration counseling, work-based learning experiences, counseling on enrollment and post-secondary education opportunities, workplace readiness training, and self-advocacy. And one thing I wanted to point out here is that you notice in the middle of the bar graph here, work-based learning experiences and counseling on enrollment and post-secondary opportunities are the 2 services that are provided least often throughout all 3 program years. And what's concerning about that is that those are the 2 services that, in at least my mind, I would think are most likely to lead to those students getting into post-secondary education and understanding what those careers that lead to credentials and higher wage earnings so they can have sustainable wages and earn those skills and hopefully going to live out of poverty and be successful.
So we've shared with you some national data. You have your state and local data. So what do we do with that? Well, in order to start thinking about how we use data to make decisions, we wanted to put this in the context of some data considerations and some caveats. So first and foremost, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You know, there's lots of data. There's no such thing as perfect data. So we have to start to weigh what data we can use and what data we need to go back to the drawing board to improve quality on. First and foremost, don't expect perfection. When you're using your outcome data, do so cautiously to inform those decisions that lead to improved data quality. You know, sometimes what I hear from states is our data aren't very good and therefore we can't make any decisions. Well, the decision that you want to make might be how to improve your data quality so that you've got good data in order to inform the decisions that you make around programming. Second caveat is don't compare state outcomes from one state to the next. That's often natural. We hear states who will call in and ask for a comparison of how they compare in competitive employment to other states. Well, state contexts differ from state to state, district to district. So we really discourage that state to state comparison. Remember too that states have a lot more data than what gets reported federally. So take a look at and talk about those outcomes. This is a great opportunity to have the conversation with your VR partner to say, well, which of my students who achieved a positive post-school outcome received pre-employment transition services as well? What's the correlation between those two? Or maybe you look at it the other way around. For those students who aren't engaged, how many of those received a pre-employment transition services? And how do we increase pre-employment transition services or other transition services in order to help students reach those positive outcomes? For each of the indicator 14 outcome area categories, 1 through 5, you can disaggregate those by gender, race, ethnicity. Some states are doing now geographic location. States may have other markers for disaggregation. So take a look at a deeper level, not just looking at those demographics for representation, but what do those demographics tell you in relation to the services their students received and to their outcomes? I can't tell you how many times I've heard local program staff say, I want to know what's happening to my students. As a matter of fact, I've never had a local teacher or service provider say, I don't really care what happens to my students. So close that loop. Share the results back to the local program staff, especially if they're the ones doing the data collection. You know, we don't want the data collection for indicator 14 to just be a task that has to get done. It should really inform that program at the local level. So tell your data collectors, these are the results from our indicator 14 data collection. And again, use those outcome data as the basis for linking your pre-employment transition services along with the predictors of post-school success. So connecting adult agencies, work-based learning experiences. Start to collect those data at a local level, ideally at a state level, to be able to make those direct connections or at least correlational directions, decisions.
All right. And then in terms of our role at the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, the collaborative, we do a number of things, and we just wanted to kind of take a moment to kind of talk about what we're in the middle of right now and how we can hopefully help support states in doing this work. So Charlotte, do you want to take the first one?
Yeah, so one of the things that we get to do is summarize the submissions for the indicators 1, 2, 13, and 14 for OSEP. So states collect those data, report them in February to OSEP. OSEP turns around and gives those data to us as NTACT, and we do an analysis for each of the indicators, transition indicators, and report those summarized results back to OSEP. So that's how we have the national trend data to share with you.
The other thing we do is engage a lot with our partners at OSEP and RSA, whether that's our project officers who manage our grant or the monitoring staff who work directly with the states. And we participate on monthly and quarterly calls to share the needs that we're seeing out in states, as well as any questions that we might have to better provide technical assistance.
So each month we get approximately 200 requests for technical assistance. Sometimes it's as simple as answering a question by email. Other times it's actually working with the state or with a local group in order to provide some technical assistance. But we respond to a wide range of individuals who are receiving and requesting technical assistance, from the local teacher who has a question to VR counselors, to state agencies, as well as a request that might come from OSEP or RSA.
We also try to be proactive with supports and technical assistance. So we have a lot of community of practices. We have one on indicator 14, one for our VR agencies that serve individuals who are blind, one for individuals with complex support needs, and many more. So I won't be able to list all of them. But in addition to that, we hold monthly office hours. We have self-studies on IDEA and transition. We do huddles and smaller groups of individuals around specific topics, as well as some of the webinars that you all may have seen, like the one that we're doing today for you all, as well as well over 250 different tools and resources that you can find on our website.
And even though we have a wealth of information on our website and within the expertise of our staff, we also recognize that there are times that we need to coordinate with other relevant TA centers in order to support the requests that come in, or to support states. And so we're always willing and encouraging to reach out to the other TA centers that are provided, IDC being an example of the QM centers being other examples. NCSI, I always want to say NCIS because I like that show, but NCSI, and other partners from our parent training centers, as well as the multitude of service providers within the TA&D network.
That kind of flows right into this next one, that for the purposes of students and youth with disabilities, looking at how can we at NTACT help support states in looking not just at their data collection, but the quality of the data and how you analyze it and how you're reporting it and using it for program improvement. So looking at those strategies that you can implement to make some of those program adjustments and really getting to some strategic planning across your partners, whether that's the VR program or other partners in your state, CTE.
Perfect example. And so Missy and I both like data, in case you haven't been able to tell that. But more importantly than just looking at the numbers and the percentages, it's really starting to make those connections with other data that get collected in order to improve programs. And so that data sharing agreement and understanding what the components are of that, it's not just a mandatory check off to be done. It really should serve the purpose of how do we use those data to improve programs.
And I'm just thinking, Charlotte, this would be a good time to just give a nod. Last month at our capacity building virtual institute, we had a two-part series on data use and sharing, one that featured some states who were working collaboratively between VR and education to share data, and then another on a session kind of picking up on what some of the themes that Charlotte and I are talking to you all today, but taking it to that level of how do you use it for strategic planning.
That's a great reminder, Missy.
So, in terms of considerations, do both agencies between VR and education really understand how the respective performance indicators support each other's goals? So when we're looking across to our partners, instead of saying, this is what I need, how do we help each other understand that we need to come to the table bringing something with us that says, this is what I can provide, or this is what I have that could possibly support what you need. You want to take the next one, Charlotte?
Yeah, you were breaking up there for a minute, so I didn't want to step on you.
I'm sorry.
And it's all right. What documentation requirements are needed to verify the outcomes for each program? Again, it goes back to understanding what those program indicators are, what the flexibility is within those, what the definitions are, and understanding those definitions of the other partner in order to determine what the documentation requirements are.
And that goes along with this next one of how we can partner to help support those specific documentation requirements. I think that one's pretty self-explanatory.
Okay. Do the local practices support shared cases and common outcomes? And so again, not just keeping that information at a state level or even at a district regional level, but really breaking that down to the local level to understand what questions are being asked, what data are available, and then being able to share those cases and those common outcomes.
And where do we need to do some cross training? So looking at what we're trying to do today, kind of setting a baseline about what we know about each other's data and how we take it down to the state and local level about where that cross training can happen and what else we might need to do to support those that are doing the work.
How can each agency help their partners achieve their outlined outcomes, whether that's through the cross training, whether that's through understanding what data are collected and the definitions around it, but starting to have a shared vision that leads to specific shared outcomes and recognizing that we're better together than we are separately.
And then looking at how we can help each other increase response rates and the ability to gather some of that long-term data that we want to see so that we can really understand what's happening as a result of the things that we're implementing for both education and the VR program.
And remembering too, to always look at what's happening within the state or within the local area and identifying those areas of expertise, those areas that we want to celebrate, but then also identifying where there are areas that offer opportunity for improvement in order to strengthen those outcomes for students. Oh, sorry. Successful outcomes in collaboration with education. And so thinking through the education lens, how do we increase the number of students participating in work-based learning prior to exit high school? We know that that's a predictor of post-school success, that students who are engaged in work-based learning while they're in high school are more likely to have positive outcomes after school. How do we use that, thinking about a student who's really interested in welding, for example, and they're really focused on what they want to do after school? How do we use that then to increase graduation rates and keep them in school to decrease those dropout rates? And then how do we increase the number of students who have identified their post-secondary goal and making sure there's alignment between what they want to do after high school with the services they're receiving in high school? Again, thinking about interagency collaboration, working with CTE courses. How do we get our VR counselors involved earlier with our students? And then increase the number of students participating in those post-secondary education and training that leads to credential attainment and or measurable skill gains and jobs that have an upward trajectory, so that we're looking at career opportunities long-term, not just simply get a job, any job will do.
And along those same lines, when we're looking at the types of outcomes that folks are getting, are they getting outcomes that are consistent with what they said they wanted to do or in their chosen career field? Are their outcomes quality outcomes? Meaning, are they earning a livable wage? Are they getting employer provided medical benefits? Are they earning those credentials and skill gains? How are we meeting the workforce needs? And how are we aligning with those labor market demands and what that's telling us? And then ultimately, how do we improve our business engagement and the relationships we establish out in the community across both VR and education?
So with that, I'll leave the disclaimer here for you for just a second. And then we'll start to highlight some resources. As Missy said earlier, there are lots of resources on the NTACT website, transitionta.org. These are just a few of the resources that are available. Missy, you want to describe some of those?
Sure. So many of them, the first one is that indicator crosswalk that Charlotte and I talked a lot about, and it kind of shows you that alignment. There's some data tools for pre-employment transition services, including a PowerPoint presentation and recording. There are several frequently asked questions. There's a 9/11 training series if you really wanted to geek out. There is a 2-part webinar series on strategic planning for pre-employment transition services. The second one features a state that worked with their education partners to do some strategic planning, and then a collaborative approach to that.
And for indicator 1 and 2, there are lots of resources. I'll highlight just a couple of them here. One's the transition gradebook to help you track the transition services that students receive while they're in school. The school completion toolkit, again, designed to keep kids in school and get them to graduation. For indicator 13, there's an FAQ, frequently asked questions, as well as checklists and case studies that walk through the different characteristics of young adults and how that might be reflected in the checklist. Indicator 14 has a couple of different tools that focus on the compliance component, the requirements for reporting, but then there's also the predictor self-assessment, predictor implementation self-assessment, and the STEPS, the state toolkit for examining post-school success, that really help you to look at your data and answer questions that will drive those program decisions.
I think with that, we can draw this to a conclusion. And then we hope that you were able to see some of the alignment and you get as excited about the opportunity to collaborate using your data as Charlotte and I are.
Don't hesitate to reach out to either of us. We're happy to ask questions or geek out with you looking at your data. So thank you, everyone. We appreciate your time.